So in this video, I'm going to go through more of your questions. I've built up quite a few now. If you ever have any questions for me as a viewer, please do leave them in the comments section, and I try to collate as many as I can, and then I answer them in these sessions. This is the 6th such session that I've done. So without further ado, let's begin. How do you feel about people commenting negatively about you on social media? Well, firstly, I don't really use social media, so I haven't seen anything. I may post more on Twitter in the future, but I won't interact very much. I just simply don't have the time, and I don't follow anyone. So I just haven't seen it, is the first thing. The second thing I'd say is that they're perfectly welcome to their opinion. Obviously, I receive a lot of praise, which is very much appreciated, and the support I've received is enormously appreciated. People are entitled to be critical if they choose. That's their right, and it doesn't really concern me. And I suppose in relation to this, thirdly, ultimately, I just don't care. All I care about is doing my work to the best of my ability, and then when I have some downtime, I certainly don't scout around Twitter looking for comments about myself. I hang out with my dog and my friends. As you may have noticed from my videos, I like to walk around in nature and spend time in beautiful places. I like food, I do a bit of cooking, I play a bit of chess. I either work very hard or I do fun things. I'm very fortunate that I've managed to... I worked very hard as a writer to establish myself and establish a career, and there were days when I started where I used to work 364 days a year, and the only reason I didn't work on Christmas Day is because no one would hire me to work on Christmas Day. And it was just, I gave everything because it's the life that I wanted to lead, and now I guess I'm a content creator as well, although I lean very heavily on my writing and research, as I think would be obvious. So I'm very grateful for the life I have, and when people say to me, you need to be careful, don't overwork, don't burn yourself out. I've got a pretty strong work ethic, and I enjoy doing creative stuff, and obviously it's very clear this is the most important thing I'm going to do in my life. It would be extraordinary if I did something more important than this. So I'm fully committed to it, and all I'm committed to doing is doing the best work that I possibly can. I don't do it to get reaction from people. I don't do it to get praise. I don't do it to have any notoriety. I have a platform. I'm fortunate now that I have a small platform. But ultimately, what is written about me on Twitter or elsewhere has no impact on my life, and I just simply don't care about it. I don't seek or desire any notoriety. I'm not reliant on other people patting me on the back, and it doesn't bother me if they say horrible things. I went to a northern comprehensive school in the 1980s. It was rough, and to be honest, it was the least rough school in the area probably. So, I grew up around, there's nothing anyone could possibly say to me that would have any impact on me. It really is a sticks and stones situation, and names are never going to hurt me anytime soon. I just produce the best work that I possibly can. That's what I'm committed to doing, and I find it bemusing and amusing that would be important to anyone else, and that I live rent-free in these people's heads, because I can assure you they're not important to me. Would you have a debate with someone? I have no interest in discussing or debating with others. I should mention that I'm also not the best person to do this, as unlike others who put themselves forward for such debates, I know that I'm not an expert and I have no qualifications. If you're going to put someone forward for a debate, I would not be the best person. I'm fully aware of this. I should say as well that if I was to do an interview or podcast in the future, which is quite possible, that's my time for me to talk. I have no interest in sharing that with anyone else, nor any reason to do so. As I mentioned, I do the best work that I can, and I get the best people on this channel to discuss the case. If anyone thinks they can produce something close to the standard that I've produced and they're pro-guilt, go for it. I'd love to see that. I'm sure you'll have countless doctors, professors and other experts queuing up to speak with you. If you do want a debate, I'm perfectly happy to arrange for you to debate with a collection of experts from neonatology, paediatrics, obstetrics, other medical specialisms, chemistry, biochemistry, nursing, statistics and law. You're welcome to bring any experts on that you know. My email address is out there. It's lucy_letby_analysis@mail.com. Drop me a line if you think you can handle it. Where are the proceeds of your book going? So I am going to keep the proceeds of my book. I should emphasise that all of my income comes from writing, and obviously now I've got some income from YouTube. I'm sure you're probably aware that it's not an enormous amount of money, but it's still very much appreciated. So I do little bits on the side of writing. I've done a bit recently. Obviously, my main focus is working on Lucy's case, but then when I have to pay the bills and make ends meet, then I'll do a bit of another project for a while. So this is my sole income. I don't have a job, and I will say that Judith Moritz and Jonathan Coffey, as far as I'm aware, they've kept all the proceeds from their book, and they have a BBC salary. I do not have a BBC salary. I have no other revenue. I have no other income. This is how I make my money, through creating content and through writing. It's the only thing I'm qualified to do. I'm probably completely unemployable by now. I've been doing this for 15 years. And obviously not YouTube. Been a writer for 15 years. So I will just say that I'm quite a frugal person. I'm quite a modest person, really, in terms of my lifestyle. I mean, I have a small house. I'm very grateful to have a small house. I don't have a car. I don't travel that much. I don't go overseas that much. I don't really buy things generally. I mean, I have very modest needs, but I do need to pay my basic bills and I do need to feed myself. And unfortunately, I can't go into a supermarket and say, right, I've got all this food. It has been decided that morally and ethically I'm not allowed to earn money from my work. So is it all right if I just take this food out of the supermarket for free? What you'll find if you try to do that is that the supermarket is not terribly receptive to your argument. So I just need a small amount of money just to pay the bills. And yeah, if my book will hopefully have some more news on that soon. And I think I'm entitled to keep the proceeds. So next question is, what can I do to help? So someone has very helpfully sent me a list of suggestions. So I'm going to go through that list with you now. So someone very kindly sent me this document regarding holding those responsible for this wrongful conviction to account. So I'll go through this. I haven't edited it too much. I'll just put it here on a Google document. Complaints can be made directly to Cheshire Police. Details are on the website. However, some people might not want to engage directly with the police. Cheshire Police keep saying this is an ongoing investigation, yet they have ignored Dr. Dimitrova, Michelle Warden, possibly others. I know for a fact that others have contacted them. It therefore seems less like an investigation and more like a cover-up. Here is the Operation Hummingbird email address, though they rarely reply: operation.hummingbird.public.contact@cheshire.police.uk. Reporting Cheshire Police. Cheshire Police should also be reported to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, formerly the IPCC. David Davis MP and Mark McDonald are the best people to raise this with, but anyone can make a complaint, especially those with legal knowledge. The Cheshire Police and Crime Commissioner, PCC, is Dan Price, pcc@cheshire.police.uk. His job is to hold Cheshire Police to account, and he does have certain powers. He can be contacted to raise complaints about Cheshire Police's mishandling of the Lucy Letby case and the many millions of pounds in taxpayers' money wasted. He himself is held to account by the Cheshire Police and Crime Panel, which is made up of local councillors. They can also be contacted regarding the Lucy Letby case. Contact details are available online. Reporting other individuals and organisations. County to Chester Hospital doctors can be reported to the GMC. Judge Goss can be reported through appropriate judicial channels. Judith Moritz can be reported to the BBC for breaching impartiality rules and for a conflict of interest in promoting a book. Complaints can also be made directly to the Council of Chester regarding their handling of the case. When Lucy was taken off the unit, she was reportedly told a pack of lies as to why, which may amount to a breach of employment law. Her nursing colleagues wanted to give her a positive character testimony at her trial, but Council Chester managers allegedly told them not to, saying it would damage their careers. This could amount to witness intimidation, perverting the course of justice, which Cheshire Police appear to have ignored. Complaints to the Council of Chester could be made by the Patient Advice and Liaison Service at cochchpals@nhs.net. Telephone numbers 01244 366 066. The current CEO is Jane Tompkinson. No direct contact details seem to be available. Complaints about Brearey, Jayaram, etc. can also be made via PALS. Petitions. There are several petitions online. I can link to one that was started by the Yellow Butterfly group. That is a good one to sign. I've signed it. I've made people aware of it before. I should mention it more often. I'll try to mention it again in the future. Refer the Lucy Letby case back to the Court of Appeal. Call for a retrial for Lucy Letby. A new petition on 38 Degrees asks that profits from Judith Morris's book be donated to a baby loss support charity. Ask viewers to sign and share these petitions. Links can be included in YouTube video descriptions. Staying informed. Watch and follow other Lucy Letby related channels, including Tea Break with Tasha, Mark Mays, According to Carl in the UK, Stuart Gillam, Lucy Letby Films, Jabe, which features the other side of Lucy Letby videos and podcasts by retired Irish doctor Michael McConville. I should also mention you can check out our TikTok, which Jabe has worked on, and there's someone else who's worked on it as well. So we still post on there whenever we can. I have given permission for my work to be used on TikTok, so we've had some very big videos on there. Check out the 19 Nurses group. Also watch Wake Up with Sonia Paulson on YouTube as she's covering the Lucy Letby case. Follow the Twitter posts of Philip Hammond, Richard Gill, Nadine Dorries, Peter Hitchens, Debbie Kennett, Rosie Waterhouse, Lucy Letby Trials, etc. So that's Lucy. Writing and contacting, write to Lucy. She's being held at HMP Prison Bronzefield. Address available online. Write to or contact MPs. If people include the full address, they should receive a reply from the local MP. MPs will usually only respond to their own constituents. Even if no reply is given, they may still read and take note. Alongside calls to release Lucy, you can also raise broader justice system reforms, such as an automatic right of appeal, an inquisitorial justice system, a crash team of top medical experts to be called in instead of police in similar hospital cases. If such a team had been called in at the Council of Chester, they would likely have found the unit unfit for purpose, and the police may never have become involved. Protests, a well-organised and successful protest took place on the 17th of March. Of course, there's one tomorrow, but that may, well, actually, I say tomorrow, I'm recording this on Thursday. This video will be going out on the day of the protest, so that may not be particularly useful for me to point that out. But there are protests taking place. If you can participate in them, then that's always useful. Someone from the Nurse Lucy Letby group has had 3 Lucy Letby badges made. Media and advocacy, contact journalists, media outlets, radio stations, TV networks, and also the Taxpayers Alliance regarding the £13 million spent on the Thirlwall inquiry. What I would say with regard to that is if you ever believe you have a story that may have mainstream media potential, please do contact me, because I'm in contact with several journalists now. Complain to Blueprint for Free Speech about the so-called Gang of Four being awarded the 2023 Whistleblower Award. They are not whistleblowers, they are scapegoating lying bullies. Eileen Chubb and a whistleblower charity wanted nothing to do with them. Demand that Blueprint revoke... I've spoken to Eileen. Demand that Blueprint revoke the Gang of Four's awards and prize money. So there's numerous suggestions there. I couldn't have done a better job than this person has at putting that together, so there's some food for thought of things you can do. You may run into a lot of brick walls, but if enough people keep trying, then it may help as well. On the insulin bag saga, do we know how many bags were meant to be injected and with how much insulin? So we don't know because it was completely made up. This is entirely hypothetical. So you could say anything. You could say Lucy Letby injected 200 bags with insulin, or you could say she injected 2. I assume that the prosecution are asserting that she injected insulin in 2 bags. I assume that's the case. Frankly, as they've completely made it up, they could say anything. You know, it's not even... There was no effort even made to demonstrate that Lucy had accessed insulin, or there was insulin missing, or there was any kind of audit, or anything like that. So it could be any number. It's pie in the sky, I think is how you would describe it. And then to move on to this question, I don't know whether someone has addressed this, but I'm curious to know what the PN insulin concentration has to be to create the observed readings on the immunoassay test cited in the trial. My understanding is that the PN bags have a shelf life of 24 hours, and each neonate would consume 2 bags over that period. This would mean 32 bags would have to be prepared by Lucy Letby for this theory to fly. Not sure how many insulin vials this would amount to. Was any of this discussed at the pre-trial/trial? So I think, in answer to your final question, the focus during the trial and during the pre-trial meeting has been very much on, are these high insulin readings and is this a low C-peptide reading? There hasn't really been any consideration into the logistics and specifics of what you've just described. I can't fully answer this question at this point in time, but what I can say is that I've spoken to several insulin experts for my book, and to just briefly summarise what they've told me, it's unlikely that it's pharmacologically possible, what has been suggested in the court case. Certainly there was no effort to demonstrate this. The prosecution made no effort to demonstrate that you could definitively do what Lucy's alleged to have done. Like, it may be literally impossible. It certainly hasn't been demonstrated to be possible. They just said, oh, we've got some readings, we don't like the readings, blah, blah, blah. And then created a circumstantial case around that. And obviously they used this very underhand strategy with Lucy of getting her to say, well, if you say someone's been poisoned, then fair enough, but I didn't do it. So I can't say whether it's 32 bags definitively, and I think it'd be very difficult for me to authoritatively answer this question, but you raise an important point about whether or not this is something that is clinically possible. It's certainly not something that was clinically demonstrated. I believe there were 16 neonates in the unit. If each neonate used one bag continuously and the absorption rate of the contents was similar, then the whole ward would have logically had to share all the bags equally. Does this make sense? And if so, why didn't the defence argue along these lines? Has anyone actually tried injecting one of the bags with insulin and noted the results? So I've kind of answered that second question. There are doubts whether this is pharmacologically active, what was alleged in court, and it definitely has not been demonstrated. There's question marks as to whether you could even adequately inject the bags in the first place, although at least that was addressed in court and they tried to suggest that it was possible. But in terms of whether you could get the effects that are alleged with the specific logistics and the specific materials that were available and the materials that are alleged to have been used is doubtful. I can't really answer the question about 16 neonates in the unit and so on and sharing the bags equally. As to why the defence didn't argue that, the overwhelming likelihood is because they just simply intellectually couldn't come to that conclusion themselves. This is why I think, as I mentioned previously, AI can actually be very useful for both defence and prosecution, because I mentioned before, when you play chess now, if the top chess players, they all work with computers. You have to work with computers, because what they do is in chess you have openings that are kind of pre-arranged moves that you'll make that are known to lots of players. You know, like one of the most famous openings is the Sicilian defence, and the moves for the Sicilian defence are always the same. There are many different sub-variations, but it always begins white plays pawn two squares forward to e4, then black plays to c5. So because there's all these standard openings, you can just give it to the computer and just say, right, I want you to study this opening for 10 hours. I'm going to go to bed, and then we'll see if you've got any new ideas when I wake up. Very similar things could happen in court cases where Ben Myers could just say to an AI platform, right, I want you to think for a really long time and do an enormous amount of research into whether there are any arguments against this. And it's quite likely that the AI would be able to come up with arguments. And obviously you can't necessarily just put those into the court case without further testing and further research, but you could then go and speak to experts, or maybe you could do your own research. Maybe you could try and find your own papers, but then I think it would be an invaluable research tool. But I think the likelihood of the defence not arguing this is because Ben Myers is not a medic, Ben Myers is not an insulin expert, Ben Myers probably wouldn't have had a clue. And if he hasn't got an expert telling him, right, you should argue this, then his hands are very much tied. So I'd suggest that is the most likely explanation. Hi Chris, the world should have more people like you. It would be a far better place. Very kind. I'm very worried about Lucy's mental health and whether or not she's being mistreated by the morons that infest the prison system. Can you say how her lawyer and family feel about her general morale? I will say that I've not spoken about this with anyone who's in contact with her, and I'm not in contact with her family. I think you're right to be concerned about her mental health. We know that Lucy's mental health at the time of the trial was very, very bad. So it would be surprising if it's top notch, but perhaps she's adjusted to some extent, and perhaps she is acclimatized as much as is possible. In terms of whether she's been mistreated, as I mentioned previously, that recent unfortunate incident in the prison service involving the singer from Lost Prophets is worrying. But I do know from other videos, I've watched an interview with this guy called Peter Trickner I've mentioned previously, who's a cocaine smuggler, and he said even at his level, he went to prison for cocaine drug selling in this country, and it was a relatively minor. I think he did a reasonably large sentence, but nothing massive. And he was a category A prisoner, and he said, I couldn't even go to the toilet on my own. You can't do anything on your own because you're just protected all the time. Lucy will be way more protected than that. Lucy's one of the most high-profile prisoners in the country, and regardless of what you think about the case, there's obviously a distinct possibility that she's innocent. That's very clear, and that is obviously now being dealt with by the system. So as much as the system has dealt with a series of enormous embarrassments, they do not want Lucy Letby to be harmed and even worse, killed, stabbed to death, for example. So I think there'll be I know there'll be an enormous amount of protection around her. As to her general morale, I think all the indication I have heard is that it's improved and that she has some hope and she's, getting on in prison as well as she possibly can. And that's all we can hope for. I'm still very concerned about Lucy's mental health and whether or not she's being badly mistreated. So this is pretty much the same thing. There's just a comment about friends and family protecting her from this harm. So what I will say is friends and family can do nothing. Once you're in this situation, you are powerless. You have to rely on the system, and you have to hope the system protects you. I suppose friends and family could raise things with the prison service, but ultimately, I'm pretty sceptical they would do anything. I mean, Lucy's on her own. Let's don't have any illusions about that. She's on her own. So we're all she's got. All we can do is do our best for her. But in terms of getting support from friends and family, they'll get to see her once a week, and that's it. Other questions about Lucy being safe in prison, so I think I've addressed those. Okay, so I've made a note here to address the Ibiza issue because I was asked a question in a previous video about, there was this question about Lucy going on holiday for 2 weeks and the death supposedly stopped and then they began again when she came back. And I mean, I dismissed this as complete rubbish, which it is. But a few people commented and said that my answer wasn't thorough enough. So I'm going to address the Ibiza issue now. So we can see on the screen here all of the incidents, the counts of which Lucy was accused of. So the first thing I want you to think about with regard to the Ibiza visit is that Lucy was away for 2 weeks. So this period here spans a year. It's 8th of June 2015 to the 25th of June 2016. So essentially it's 54 weeks. So within that 54-week period, you have 26 individual periods of 2 weeks. So this 2-week period where Lucy went away to Ibiza was one of just 27 similar periods during this over a year that the indictment relates to. So this accusation about Ibiza is just a classic example of human confirmation bias, human seeking patterns in things that are nonsensical, which happens all the time. We've seen with this case how poor people generally are at mathematics and statistics. So here, this is the first 2-week period where things begin to kick off on the unit, where there are unfortunately some deaths of infants. So that's a 2-week period, and Lucy's around for that 2-week period. Let's just ignore that period for now, because I want to look more at the other periods. So then, from the 22nd of June to the 4th of August, nothing happens. So that's approximately 6 weeks. The 6 weeks, so that's 3 lots of 2-week periods. So as far as we know, Lucy's working on the unit during that. Well, she's definitely working on the unit. We don't know if she took a holiday, but if she did take a holiday, it would just be 2 weeks out of those 6 weeks. So she's there on the unit for 4 weeks, working on the unit, and nothing happens. So I'm sure you can imagine what I'm going to say in the rest of this video already. So in the Ibiza incident, they said, she was away for 2 weeks and nothing happened, then she came back. Well, she was on the unit for 4 weeks there, at least, and probably 6 weeks, and nothing happened. And then there were some other unfortunate incidents. And then I'll go all the way down here to Baby I, which is on the 23rd of October, 2015. So a lot of these attempted murders are just so weak. But there's no other murders on the unit, even according to the prosecution case, even according to those who believe Lucy is guilty of murder. There's nothing to indicate any malfeasance that would result in death between the 23rd of October and the 23rd of June. So that's exactly 8 months. It's approximately 32 weeks. So there's 16 lots of 2-week periods during that period. And even these supposed attempted murders, there's big gaps between them. So there are countless 2-week periods all the way through the indictment period where Lucy's is on duty, Lucy's working on the unit, and nothing happens. Nothing untoward happens. So the 2-week period in Ibiza that is cited is, as I say, just one of 27 periods in which Lucy could have been on the unit or could not have been on the unit. And this is just being cited as somehow significant because no, she went on holiday, quote unquote, nothing happened, and then she came back. So therefore, the fact that she'd gone on holiday and then came back is significant. But actually, we see it's not different from any number of other 2-week periods. It's just that there's sometimes described as Pavlovian conditioning or Pavlovian association due to the psychologist Pavlov, where you associate an event. The classic thing is, and you can teach dogs to do this, but the original Pavlovian association is someone rang a bell while dogs were being fed, and then eventually they took the food away, kept ringing the bell, and the dogs started salivating. So you create an association between two events. That association is not founded in reality, because ringing a bell does not mean a dog will get food. Similarly, Lucy Letby going away, then coming back, and then there's some incidents, that's completely unrelated to the incidents. It's just an error of human reasoning to think, oh, that's significant because Lucy went away and then came back, but you're ignoring all of the 2-week periods in which Lucy was on the unit and nothing happened. So I hope that's clear. I mean, that's why I dismissed it so blithely and so perhaps flippantly, is because I just know it's complete crap and complete nonsense. But I hope I've demonstrated now why it is nonsense. Hi Chris, following the conclusion of the grievance procedure in 2017, the hospital promised to fund a degree course for Lucy. As I understand it, she continued to be employed by the hospital and she was summarily terminated in 2020, although it seems she was suspended following her first arrest in 2018. Do you happen to know whether the hospital ever did fund that study course? If they did she complete it and did she pass the course? So it's very difficult to find out the answer to this question. It's not something that I've encountered in my research so far. Because such a veil has been drawn around the hospital now, it's very difficult to get any kind of answers to any question like this. I think the hospital had probably begun funding it and that she was studying for it at the time. That's my understanding. I don't think she passed the course because she didn't reach the end of it before the proverbial hit the fan, unfortunately. So I hope that answers your question. It's difficult to get a definitive answer, but I suspect that they would have funded it had this horrible situation not emerged. One thing I never fully understood was about Dr. A, and that I read he told her about concerns and emails going around and that he would be on her side provided with a statement, etc. But when he came to court, this changed. I just never understood why this happened, and he was telling her things. So there's numerous interpretations of this. A very natural interpretation would be that he was a snake and he just decided that he would betray her. It's very hard to know exactly what was going through his mind when he was sending these messages, of course. He may have genuinely believed in Lucy and he may have genuinely thought that he would defend her, and then the other consultants got into him, and there's always an element of self-preservation as well. It's very unfair the way these things work out, but effectively, considering the hospital warned everyone else, if he'd have been in court defending Lucy, he would have been in a minority of one. And it's all very well and good for us sitting here saying he should have done this, but I believe his identity is quite wrongly, and I really condemn this, been leaked online. I don't know his identity, but I know it's been on Tattle, I believe. There could be serious recriminations for him. Physical recriminations, not just criticism or abuse. So we shouldn't be too hard on him in that sense. But it certainly would have been a blow for Lucy when he gave evidence against her, and to some extent betrayed her. Now, whether or not he was genuine in his text messages, or whether he'd already decided that he was going to stab Lucy in the back, we will never know. There's simply no way of knowing, so there's no point to me speculating. But it's possible that he'd already decided, right, well, I'm going to side with the consultants. And it's also possible that he was a genuine friend of Lucy. And it's also possible that he had designs on her. We just don't know. There's no way of knowing. There's nothing in her text messages to say they had a romantic relationship. That's clear. Whether or not he wanted one and expressed this privately, or even didn't express it at all, but hoped that she would come round to the idea eventually, I don't know. Who knows? It's impossible to say, but I think that essentially what happened is he had backed her to a certain point and then he decided, I'm not going to back you now. Did the police talk to the coroner who provided the original reports? As far as I am aware, the police have not talked to the coroner, but I couldn't say that with complete certainty because I'm not privy to everything the police have done. I've never seen any evidence that the police conversed with the coroner. Can someone order Evans to stop writing reports and stop going on TV and calling Lucy evil? Well, obviously that's an enormous asset for us, so I won't be telling him to stop doing that. The police have obviously tried to keep him quiet and failed. His family have probably, I would imagine, said stuff to him and failed. I would say he's someone that if you're critical of him, he just simply cannot keep his mouth shut. Such is his arrogance. Surely now that the case is with the CCRC, there is the possibility of a new trial. All these antics are insanely prejudicial. Yeah, which is a good thing for us, obviously. All he's doing is helping Lucy's case, correct, and destroying his credibility, correct, and a potential future prosecution, quite possibly. How could a future prosecution use him? But if they don't, where will they find an equivalent to him? So as far as I understand it, Dr. Evans must appear in the Court of Appeal if called. He'd have to have an extremely good reason, such as ill health or death. I'm not wishing that to happen to him. I don't wish for him to be unhappy. I don't have a high opinion of him, but basically he'd have to appear in the Court of Appeal as far as I understand it. If there was a retrial, as crazy as it sounds, the prosecution can do something completely different. So they don't even need to use their embolism. They can start all over again with different experts and come up with completely different explanations. Obviously, they probably won't do that because it would look ridiculous. They wouldn't want to use him in a future prosecution because he's completely discredited already. But as you say, it will be difficult to find an equivalent who'll come up with the same ideas. And I think medical experts won't want to touch it, which is one of the many pressing, difficult to respond to questions about a retrial. But certainly if Evans had any sense of self-preservation, he would have shut his mouth. But perhaps he realises how deep he is, dug into this situation, and he just realises, I've got to do something. But yeah, I mean, the guy's an idiot. I mean, he's an absolute embarrassment. By the time Lord Chief Justice Jackson wrote to Lord Chief Justice Goss in December 2022, highlighting how inappropriate Dewi Evans was as an expert witness, Lucy Letby's trial had already begun. Should Lord Chief Justice Jackson have had an obligation to expedite the matter much quicker? So I think if he felt that strongly about it, he should have an obligation, I would agree. But what you have to perhaps understand is that he may not have known about this. That's the first thing. He may not have known that Evans was involved, or we don't know the full timeline of when he became aware, when he decided to make this decision, etc. The second thing is I'm reliably informed that a judge of his prominence does not write to another judge very often and say, this expert witness is worthless and has done worthless work and was completely biased and you should watch out for him. That will be something that he will have considered very carefully. So he maybe was waiting to see whether Evans featured in the court case and how much he featured. And then at a certain point, he maybe had a word with himself, figuratively speaking, and searched his conscience and decided, I've got to do something about this. What can I do? I could write a letter to the judge. It's a pretty extraordinary. I don't know if it's correct to describe it as unprecedented, but it's a very unusual intervention. I wish he had intervened more quickly, but we're going to go on to discuss that in the next question. Would Lord Chief Justice Goss have been more inclined to act and have disallowed Dewi Evans being able to give evidence if the warning had arrived well in advance? The opportunity to have Evans removed as an expert witness appears to have been lost. So I can only give my opinion on this question. Given what Lord Justice Goss decided, and given my opinion on the establishment and how it tends to operate, I don't think he would have thrown him out of the case. The reason I say this is that he decided that it was up for the jury to decide whether or not Dewi Evans was credible, which is ridiculous, but that was the decision that he made. He could equally have made that decision before the trial, and in my opinion, the reason that he didn't and wouldn't throw Dewi Evans out is because he knew the trial would collapse. It's not just that it would have been more expense. I mean, the next question is about whether it would have been delayed by some considerable time, incurring more expense. I suppose if it happened before the trial, there's the outside possibility that they could have delayed the trial. I suppose. I can't really comment on that because I don't know enough to comment. But I think basically if Evans is thrown out the case will collapse whatever happens, because it's taken him 5 years to get to that point. And if he was just thrown out, I think certainly during the court case, it definitely would have collapsed. But I think even beforehand, I don't think the Crown Prosecution Service would have been able to say, oh, look, our lead expert's been thrown out, but don't worry, we'll just spend a few years getting another one together. The case would have collapsed, it would have been all over. And I think Lord Justice Goss was very much aware of this. I'm certain he was very aware of this. And I'm sure that was the primary motivation for his decision. I just don't think he had the guts to do it. I think he knows damn well Debbie Evans should have been thrown out, and he just wouldn't do it because the criminal justice system would have looked ridiculous. Does anyone know if even a single qualified statistician has ever been employed to work on this case for any period between the start of the investigation through to the current date by either the police, investigation team, the CPS or the CCRC? If not, the CCRC should by rights get in touch with Professor Hutton. We simply cannot leave these statistical issues to people without the necessary training and experience. So firstly, I'll deal with the second point first. As far as I'm aware, Jane is involved with the defence now. That's the first thing. And then secondly, the answer simply is no. There wasn't a single qualified statistician who was ever employed. Obviously, they engaged in the initial contact with Jane and then it didn't happen, which is very regrettable, of course, because she could have nipped it in the bud or at least given the police some very serious and very important advice. If you haven't seen the interview that I did with Professor Hutton, please do watch that. It's on my channel. The question that came to mind was whether the hospital executives were legally required to call in the Health Security Agency as per the 2011 regulations as mentioned. So I would surmise that if you are aware of unsanitary conditions in this environment that is as sensitive as a neonatal unit and you do not act on those, on that understanding and on that knowledge, then you must be in breach of some regulations. There can't be a situation where you know there's sewage on the unit and you don't do anything and that's deemed okay. I mean, clearly you're in breach of some health and safety, some health security, some regulations, without going into depth about precisely what those regulations say. I think absolutely anyone, it's not just the executives. I mean, I think the executives will, what would happen, as far as I would understand it, is that, as an example, if nurses became aware of the situation, it would be their job to escalate. Of course, what they would do is escalate it to the paediatric lead on the unit. And I'm sure that they were aware of it, and I'm sure that they were legally required to do something. What is your take on the media agenda on this case? It seems that they are pro-guilt in general. Do you know why that might be? So I have discussed this in previous videos. So I'm going to explain firstly why. I mean, I would say now it's close to 50-50. So I don't necessarily agree with the premise that it's pro-guilt now. But I do agree that there's still pro-guilty publications and pro-guilty articles. And definitely that position has changed over time. There was obviously a time when it was very much pro-guilty. In one of my kind of what you might describe as philosophical discussions, I was discussing about why people have an investment in the system. There are numerous reasons. Sometimes they're self-serving reasons, and other times it is because we're all inculcated into a belief that things are basically okay. I was explaining, if you have a 4-year-old child or a 3-year-old child, unless you're living in such circumstances that means it's essential. So you might be living in Stasi-esque society where they just have to know the facts of life from a young age. But typically, you obviously shield them to a certain extent. You don't tell a 3-year-old child or a 4-year-old child or very young people, you don't say, oh, by the way, you could just be arrested when you're an adult. You could have done nothing wrong, and then you might go, there's any number of things that you could tell them about the way the world works. I know for me, I had to, most of the things, my understanding, and most of the things that I both understand and believe to be the case came from my own efforts, really, because my family shielded me from the way the world was. I mean, I did grow up in quite a rough place at the time, and I wish I mean, I couldn't be shielded from it forever because in the end I was there at secondary school, and then you find out that's when your adult life kind of begins. Then you find out what it's like, and then obviously I'm questioning many other things outside of that as well. So, but typically you're not brutally honest to a 3-year-old or 4-year-old. So we all grow up generally, almost always, with the kind of understanding that the system is okay, and then we're very much, the education system. If you go to school, you're not going to be told the state is a terrible thing. The state, not that I'm saying that it is, but these are state schools. The state schools can have a certain agenda and they're going to have a certain perspective. So then you're inculcated with that perspective as well. So it's just basically, it's what I've heard Chomsky describe as institutional bias. So a lot of people will have institutional bias. He's a lot more critical of the media than I would be. I would be less critical, and a lot of the reason for that is something that I want to come on to now, which is that I've got to know and meet several journalists through doing this work and working on this very important case, and there are some tremendous people working in the media, and I've actually been really encouraged by the response, with numerous newspapers coming out really strongly, and that's a good thing. It shows there are people that care, and there are people that want to make a difference. They're not just, it's not even just about getting clicks. I mean, they genuinely care, and they genuinely recognise this is an awful thing that's happened, and they care about Lucy's well-being. So although you've said that they are pro-guilt in general, I do think now the tide has turned to a great extent, and it's more even at the very least. And I know there are very committed people that very much are pro-innocence and pro-miscarriage of justice. So there are good people working in the media. Of course, it's disappointing. I mean, I've had my say on the BBC. I don't feel that as an organisation, that is an organisation that can be trusted, or that we should give money to. And of course, as I mentioned, there's the institutional kind of bias that we have of being brought into the world and being told. I mean, Stephen Phelps was talking about this in the interview. He was saying talking about this kind of imperial sense of superiority of believing, oh, we're the best at this, we're the best at that. And of course, we all drink that with our mother's milk. Probably less so today, but he's older than me. He's of the generation where they definitely drank that with their mother's milk, and I had that to a certain extent. So even though I'm a questioning person, you still have that as part of your upbringing, a part of your perspective on life. So the media is only a reflection of people, and people are only a reflection of the society, and the society is only a reflection of the values of the society. The values of the society are always a reflection of who inculcates or who conveys those values to the society as a whole, and almost inevitably it's people at the top. So I hope that answers your question. Why didn't Myers point out in court how ludicrously inept the police were to attach any importance to the taking home of handover notes? I don't know how this was presented in the trial. So I think, again, the most likely explanation is, firstly, it was very difficult to get nurses in court, as we know. Nurses from the hospital were warned not to appear. Other nurses don't want to be seen to be taking home handover notes in a court case. It would be very difficult for any nurse to say, oh yeah, I accidentally take home information I'm not supposed to take home, then keep it in my house, even though hundreds of nurses have told me that's the case, and it's just something that happens. So that's the first problem. The second problem is he just may not know. He may not understand that. I do feel more effort could have been made in numerous areas, and perhaps this is one, but he just simply may not know how common it is. And I think that's a very likely explanation. It is scary that someone as thick as Paul Hughes, those are your words, not mine, is given so much power. Who does he report to? Was there any oversight or scrutiny of the investigation? So he is not literally the head of Cheshire Police, so ultimately he's responsible to someone, but he was the head of this investigation. So this would be a great question for Stephanie. I'll try and put this one to Stephanie if I remember. He will naturally have to report to someone, and there must be some degree of oversight or scrutiny. But at the end of the day, he was put in charge. He was the investigative lead, so he's the boss ultimately. You know, it's like a traditional football manager. If you went back to the days of Wenger and Ferguson, they didn't report to anyone. That theoretically they can be sacked by the organisation, but at the end of the day, they can't go to this. It's just they pick the team. They delegate things they to some extent hire people that work for the organisation. Their head's on the line if results aren't good. That's pretty much how it is as far as I'm aware, but it'll be interesting to see what Stephanie has to say about that. What do you expect or think will happen to the police and CPS and these so-called journalists when Lucy's found innocent? So, I firstly should say that this is just my opinion, and my opinion is no more valid than anyone else's, but the police will probably weasel their way out of it, because they usually do. They weaseled their way out of Hillsborough almost entirely, and that was a calamitous situation where nearly 100 people died, tens of thousands of people witnessed it. It was completely their fault, and they really faced no consequences at all. One would hope that there'd be more effort made to communicate with the police how to investigate cases, because at the moment they don't really know. The big fundamental problem with this whole issue is that the police don't know how to investigate cases. What they do is find a suspect and then investigate that suspect. And I know they would deny that. I mean, again, this is another question I'd like to put to Stephanie. I'd like to put my view across of what I believe to be the case about police investigations and then ask her if she agrees. I think she'll give a more moderate view because she's more informed than me, and I'm just an outsider that doesn't have a very high opinion of the police necessarily at this point in time. So it'll be interesting to see what she says. But my view is that the police should definitely face, and not just Cheshire Police, the police as an institution, organisation in this country, should be educated on how to investigate cases. Whether that will happen, I mean, I'm extremely doubtful, because they usually weasel their way out of anything without any consequences whatsoever, and no one wants to grasp the very prickly nettle of reforming the police, because it's too complicated. The CPS may face consequences. What would be more likely to happen? They've no doubt, almost certainly, followed their guidelines and regulations correctly. It's just that the guidelines and regulations are crap to begin with. So what could happen is there could be an effort made to address or investigate failings in the CPS and failings in the regulations guidance that they've been given. That's possible. I don't think that they will. I think you'll find that they've done what they're told to do, and the failings are in the system, not in the people that work for the CPS or the way the CPS operates. It's more systemic. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, because the free press is very important, journalists that wrote things about Lucy won't face any consequences because they're entitled to write whatever they want. Is there not a case to be made that the police investigation was prejudicial and biased from the outset and should be subject to investigation by the IOPC? Yes, there should be a case. It was clearly biased. Whether or not you describe it as prejudicial is debatable. I'm not sure what the precise definition of that word would be in this context. I mean, there's very obvious confirmation bias, and there should be investigation by the IOPC, clearly. As I just said previously, the whole gamut of how police investigations are constructed and the ethos behind it should be subject to significant inquiry. It's very clear they don't know. They're good at prosecuting in a case where someone is definitely guilty. Like, I've just been hearing one on the radio about, I don't know exactly what happened, some horrible killing. I don't know if the guy's pleaded guilty, but it appears, I wouldn't like to say without having looked at the case myself, but it appears that there's no real doubt because his parents accept that he's guilty. I don't know the full details, but that's where they excel. Is right. You need to get a result. This guy's dangerous. We need to put him away. That's where they're good. Arguably, I mean, I'm sure people would say they make failures. They make mistakes in those circumstances, but that's the ethos of the police, in my estimation. If there's any doubt, and if there's a kind of open-ended situation, that's where they've got massive problems. So I would hope there'd be an inquiry, and they certainly should be subject to some form of investigation. That's absolutely baked into the cake, in my estimation. Thank you, Chris. Your humour makes the pain of this just about bearable. Well, I do try to get some jokes in when I can. I want to know why it is ever appropriate for the police to discuss their cases via the Daily Mail. Hughes is an imbecile, that's your opinion, not mine, and I worry society is doomed if he is the usual calibre of SIO. Whoever promoted him has a lot to answer for. Are those above him equally stupid, or is Hughes a useful idiot? So He, as I've just kind of discussed about people above him, firstly, so I won't go into that. In terms of whether those, what one would like to imagine and one would like to believe that if you see the head of Scotland Yard on TV, that person is reasonably intelligent. Now, I can't say that with a lot of confidence, but there should be a kind of certain educational calibre and intellectual calibre to someone who is in a position of seniority in an organisation that's as critical to society as the police. Obviously, at this point in time, I cannot definitively say that they are more intelligent than him. In terms of whether it's appropriate for the police, as you know, I've been critical of Cheshire Police. I'll continue to be critical of them. And in my view, the conduct of Hughes has been deeply inappropriate. However, as they're the police, they can just basically do whatever they want, seemingly. I noticed in Lucy Letby's Wikipedia page there is information on drug calculation errors she's alleged to have made in 2014 and 2016. I would have thought the information being put out there should really be confidential. So I think in normal circumstances it would be, but because this is a big, high-profile thing, this came out in the Thirlwall inquiry, of course, because it's a big, high-profile inquiry and there's lots of very high-paid, high-powered lawyers, they probably thought we could just say this and no one's going to stop us. So I think under usual circumstances it probably would be confidential, but under these circumstances it's not. Why didn't the defence call their own expert witness to counter Evans' opinion? So we discussed this. Actually, I've discussed this in a forthcoming interview that I've recorded but not released yet. I was going to say I've recorded this in an interview that you've already seen, but I don't know how much I did discuss that with Stephen Phelps. But I think a lot of it really comes down to Professor Michael Hall, not being the kind of person that Evans is, who's just willing to say absolutely anything. And so as a consequence of that, I think the defence thought strategically it's not the right thing to do to call him and that it could count against Lucy. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think they should have put him in the case and he should have spoken. Certainly in some of the cases, he could have provided very definitive information that would have pointed to natural causes for some of these collapses and deaths. However, Ben Mize is a more experienced barrister than me, and he obviously thought, well, we need to win every case or Lucy's going to prison. So he has taken what he believed to be the correct strategic move, and I don't agree with that, but if he, we obviously can't speak at the moment, but he would have his reasons for doing it. Why does the CCRC take so long? So I think there are several reasons for this. Let's go over the reasons about systemic failing first. So it's well known that the CCRC is underfunded, it's well known that it's understaffed. Obviously they've been criticised heavily in previous cases. So at this point in time, they're not fit for purpose. And also, it must be acknowledged and it should be stated that that's not me saying that. The CCRC, it has been openly indicated that the CCRC has not been fit for purpose and has failed as an organisation. That's why they brought in Vera Bird. And to be fair, I've said before, she's taking an active role in attempting to at least give different optics for the organisation. Whether anything is really changing, we don't know. But she does seem to be taking it seriously that they've been very criticised in previous cases, rightly so. So that's a good thing, but nevertheless, we'd be naive to think it's going to change overnight, and this is still a systemically inadequate organisation. In their defence, we can also say this is a complex case in which a lot of information has been submitted, and there is an argument that it would have been better to submit less information. Someone has told me this, who is well informed. There is an argument it would have been better to submit less information to the CCRC. However, I'm not qualified to say that. I'm just recounting what someone else has told me. But basically, they will go through the information and they're not really qualified to look at it. So, yeah, I know it's frustrating for people, but Lucy's going to be referred more quickly than would usually be the case. So we must try to focus on the positives if we can. Do you know if any of the parents believe Lucy Letby is innocent? I don't know this. I don't think anyone other than their lawyers, who are protecting them very carefully, and the parents themselves, will know. Considering that in the ITV documentary the parents with the box were willing to consider this possibility, it's possible as well that some of these parents have considered it. What I will say to you is that I mentioned before in the case of Kathleen Folbig, her husband gave evidence against her in court and he went to the grave. I believe he died last year. He went to the grave believing Kathleen was guilty even after exoneration. So when you have these very emotional cases, it can be very, very difficult once people have processed something and had closure. It can be very difficult for them to intellectually change their view or change their mind. I would like to believe that I'd be asking serious questions at this point, but I will also say I've never been through anything as traumatic as losing an infant, and it's certainly not my place to make assertions about how I would think or behave in those circumstances. The short answer to your question is simply no, I don't know, but I hope some of them are asking questions. Thank you for interviewing this great guest. Once again, it highlights the significant medical issues ignored in the case. Is it true that there were 9 stillbirths at the Countess of Chester during the 2015 to 2016 period? Well, I don't have the stillbirth list in front of me, but it's known that they had an elevated number of stillbirths. That's very much acknowledged. That's in the Royal College report. That was part of the referral to Embrace, along with 20 other hospitals. So it's true that they had an elevated number of stillbirths during this period. I believe they only said the judge was entitled to exclude it, and if so, is it not therefore a materially worse than worthless judgment? So this is again referring to the stillbirths, presumably. I probably should have made this a bit clearer for myself, but I presume that it's referring to stillbirths. A lot of things were excluded from this case. Of course, we know the Royal College report was excluded as an example. I mean, I find that unbelievable, frankly. It's critical context on the hospital, and yet the jury's denied the right to see it. Unbelievable. We can say whatever we like about it being materially worse than worthless, or however you wish to put it, but at the end of the day, it's legally sound from a procedural point of view. And once it's in the court, and once they sit and have a court case, once the judge bangs his hammer at the end, that's it. Unless there's a procedural mistake you can point to, which I'm sure someone would have pointed one out by now if there was one. So essentially, it doesn't even matter. Of course, loads of stuff in the court case is absolutely worthless. Of course it is. But once it's in a court, it then gets put on this enormous pedestal, and you have to chip away at it to try and knock the pedestal down. Do you think the hospital should be investigated by another hospital, or is it all just NHS and they seek to protect themselves? So they should be investigated by an impartial, independent organisation, which would most likely be an existing healthcare organisation within the NHS system. It's clear that there should be a very thorough investigation, and a neutral body is the only suitable organisation to do that. Whether they'd give that to the Care Quality Commission, that would raise alarm bells because, for example, I spoke to Eileen Chubb about this, and I know she won't mind me saying that she was very critical of the Care Quality Commission. So I'm not sure who would investigate it. Maybe it would be the Royal College again. Who knows? But there should be an investigation. There should be a credentialed investigation. There should be a thorough investigation. And most importantly, there should be an independent investigation. 2 things. Was Professor Arthur's study hastily arranged to allow him to salvage his not torpedoing Evans' serial meandering? Is this the diagnostic choice selection from the jukebox of diagnosis plucked from the air, namely air embolism? So, in the case of Professor Arthur's, I don't know how hastily it was arranged or not arranged, but you've all heard me say that when Lucy Letby was first arrested, they had no information from any other witness. It was entirely on the basis of the opinion of Evans. So I don't think we can say it was hastily arranged because they had 5 years to do it. So it certainly shouldn't have been hastily arranged. They should have had plenty of time to organise everything. But whether it was... So it's important to say, Professor Arthur's has not supported Dr. Evans in court in any way. So he doesn't really salvage what Evans is going on about. I think the reason that the study... Well, I'm not really sure why the study was commissioned. If anything, it counts more for the defence than the prosecution. So I've really gotten no idea why there's a study. It was arranged. It's never published anywhere. It's not really a proper study at all, to be perfectly honest. If you can't look at the data and if other scientists can't read it, then it's not really worth the paper it's written on, to be perfectly honest. He could have written anything. But even then, to be fair, in his defence, and I'm not saying that to be critical of Professor Arthurs, I'm just saying from a scientific point of view, this wouldn't be considered acceptable. I mean, I'm sure I know Richard Gill well enough to say that I'm sure he'd have a very withering view of that. But, the fact is this was allowed to be done. But what I will say is that he was honest enough to provide this evidence which indicates that air is present in infants with some regularity. So I think that's the kind of takeaway from that. With case A, so presumably meaning child A, is a very pertinent example where previous Munchausen by proxy symptoms of accusing suffocation and noxious substance have been mentioned to be discarded. So one thing I've mentioned in a previous video, you can look this video up if you haven't seen it, is that Evans still mentioned noxious substance in court in relation to a case where he never even made the allegation there was a noxious substance. So I think his conduct in court was appalling. Obviously, he ruled out suffocation, supposedly, as well. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about this too much because I've heard varying opinions about Evans and Munchausen by proxy. I don't think I can properly answer this question without being libelous and give an honest opinion. I mean, I've heard various things. I agree. I mean, what we can say, let me say this. There seems to have been a fundamental, I mean, not just seems, it seems very strongly that there's been a fundamental effort to just find what possible method can I find by which the defendant is guilty, which is why he just looked at all of these methods of murder and never, as Professor Lee rightly said in the press conference, never considered any of the context and never considered anything that could have exonerated Lucy Letby, even though he tried to respond to that in the documentary, but his response was quite pathetic, let's be fair. If the judge said to the jury, you can assume all deaths were murder if you can only decide a few were, how will that work in civil litigation for damages? Backed up with a wild guess from a criminal judge may not pass the sniff test of being an absolute. The judge has just tied up all loose ends by instructing the jury to not be unsure. So I agree with your second comment completely. I think it's obviously, again, it's something the law allows. So when I say it's unacceptable, it should be considered unacceptable from any kind of decent standards or ethical point of view. But obviously, it is acceptable because it happened. In terms of civil litigation for damages, I'm not sure it would have a legal impact because if there's civil litigation, they will look at the individual circumstances of each infant. So I think the judge's verdict won't have any meaningful impact on that. If and when this unravels, I mean, it's fair to say the hospital will face civil litigation. That's very, very likely. It would be enormously surprising if they didn't. So I don't think that will have much of an impact on that. However, I believe the same person has asked the next question, which is also a pertinent question. As Judge Goss instructed the jury, proof of guilt in one of the charges could influence their deliberations on all cases. Could that now mean conversely that establishing innocence in one case could therefore suggest innocence in all cases? So I would have presumed not, but Dr. Philip Hammond, writing in Private Eye, he pointed out that if one of the cases falls, they could all fall. Now, I don't think the Court of Appeal will just allow one case to go and then we'll just say, right, we'll overrule all the cases. I don't know what's going to happen exactly, but because they're chain linked together, it does seem that this is a possibility. I think it's fair to say that the standards required to exonerate Lucy will be higher than the standards that were required to convict Lucy, but that's just the extremely unfair system that we're dealing with. From the letter to Byrne from the Council of Chester, I'm requesting a forensic investigation, so where are the forensic test results? So it's also worth noting, you're absolutely right, but also Brearey and Jayaram on hopefully the meeting that I've made infamous by now on the 15th of May, where they met with the police, Jayaram says we want to have a multidiscipline review. So there was no multidiscipline review of these cases. They arrested Lucy Letby when they had evidence from one person. So they didn't do anything that they were requested to do. They were also, in the letter, they were also requested to exclude unnatural causes. So we've been through the first part of Operation Hummingbird the other day, to what extent would you say that the police excluded unnatural causes? It's clearly not what they did at all. So it's very obvious that the police were just way out of their depth, completely incompetent. They didn't have a slightest clue how to investigate this case, and they've just monumentally failed. And now they're scrambling around trying to deny this and trying to avoid looking stupid and being criticised, which unfortunately is inevitable. Eventually they're going to have to field an enormous amount of criticism, and I'm sure that they'll stab Dr. Evans in the back and try and blame him for everything. Doctors consult with other doctors all of the time. If the consultants really believed in air embolism, why did they not consult Dr. Shoo Lee? So I wouldn't be too critical of this, because they're citing his academic paper to prove their... Dr. Evans is citing his academic paper to prove his hypothesis or thesis. I don't think you should necessarily have to contact someone if you're using their research correctly. Obviously, the first problem that we all know about is that he wasn't using it correctly, which is pretty fundamental. The second, he should be able to do that as someone who described himself at the time as a consultant paediatrician. He should be able to read an academic paper and understand it and implement it with some degree of competence. This guy is just not a competent person at this point in time. Whether he was a competent doctor back in the day, I don't know. I wouldn't like to comment on that. But it's fairly clear that he's a person of modest intellectual ability, and I think his knowledge base was nowhere near up to the standard. That's even if he tried his best and acted completely in good faith. The second point I'd like to raise, I think is very important, and probably hasn't been mentioned enough, is that if you look at his report, the quality of work is abysmal. Considering this should be like PhD standard at least. It should be doctorate standard work to go into a court case like this. And, he's just picked out one study and said, according to this study, it says this, so therefore this is my medical diagnosis. I mean, anyone will tell you that it's just rubbish. Even if you'd use the papers correctly, it would have to be something very, very distinct if you were going to use it in that way. If you're going to just look at one academic paper, then you'd have to be citing something that is so definitive, because you should look for alternative views, or you should look for alternative papers, and that's what a literature review is. A literature review means, as the name would suggest, that you review the literature. You don't just pick up one academic paper and go, look, it says here this. Right, I'll just put that into the court case. That's it. I've done academic research now. That's not how it works. But I think Dr. Evans is just way below the intellectual standard to engage in a literature review. He hadn't really... he does have a few papers that he'd co-authored. This is going back decades, but he was a very minor co-author of those papers. And he's not an academic, and it's a very long time since he studied at university, and I think he's nowhere near up to the standard, with all due respect. I don't know, I don't want to say this flippantly, but I think I obviously don't have the trainings in paediatrics, but I think in terms of my ability to research things, I'm on a completely different level to what he can do. And I think I'm certain that Colin Morley, if you'd have given him the opportunity to do a literature review, it would have been very different results, because he's obviously a very esteemed neonatologist and has a kind of pretty glittering academic background. So I think if he'd dealt with it, he would have dealt with it completely differently. He wouldn't just sit there and go, look, I found one paper that says something, so now I'm convinced that it's murder. And some of the things he said in court about, he'd cite one academic paper that says something about infant screaming and then say, okay, I've now decided that this is definitely air embolism because there's an eyewitness report that said one of the babies was crying at some point. It's garbage. It's embarrassingly primitive, I think would be a reasonable description. So one of the more important thing for me is not that he didn't contact Dr. Shoo Lee, which he doesn't have to do if he's doing a literature review. I don't know how common that would be, but I'm sure that they happen all the time without phoning up all the scientists. But I think a bigger mistake was just the quality of the literature review and the quality of the reports that he produced as a consequence of that. Right, so I've got a question here about Lucy being photoshopped. So I can say definitively that Lucy's been photoshopped in some of the images that have been presented. Why this has happened, who has done it, etc., I don't know, but I'm very confident this is the case. So I'm going to give you a short demonstration here of how easy it is to manipulate a photograph or alter a photograph. You require absolutely no skill it really requires no ability whatsoever to do this. But if you have a little bit of photoshopping ability, obviously it's easier still. So on the screen now, you can see an image that I've created myself of Lucy Letby, and you can see the original on the right hand side of the screen. So you can see how blurry the right hand image is. So in order to create a good quality thumbnail, I tweak this image a little bit to make it clearer, which is very easy to do. So I've already copied and pasted the image on the right. So if we go here, we'll save this. There we go. So I'll get rid of that now and go to this program. So this is one of the many programs that you can use. And I've got the image here. You just drag that into there. And you just take a few seconds. And there's once you get it here, so as you can see, you just zoom up into her face. Already it's very much enhanced from what it was. And there's all kinds of options you can do here. You can change the skin tone. You can do all kinds of stuff. That's how easy it is. So on the image that I've seen of Lucy, you can tell that it's been doctored because there's a picture of her where she's been crying with red eyes, and that's been taken out. And also there are images of her that have been circulating where she's got kind of very, not being rude, but she's got little marks where she's had spots as a teenager, as many of us do. And they sometimes show up in very close-up photographs. These are very unflattering police portraits, of course, but in some of the photographs they just disappear. So I could show you that being done as well. I can easily do that, but if you have any skills with Photoshop, there's all kinds of things you can do, but it's very, very easy now to, I will improve images myself. I always try to keep them as authentic as possible, but I will improve images for YouTube just to make sure that I get the clearest image possible because that's required for the thumbnail. So I'm absolutely certain that Lucy's images have been photoshopped at some point. As to why that has happened, I don't know. Is Lucy Letby still being investigated for more crimes? So firstly, there's her cases that are with the Crown Prosecution Service. Whether or not they will advance that, I doubt that they will, but we'll see. In terms of whether she's still being investigated, sadly the answer to that question is yes. I don't think the investigations will go anywhere, but yes, I happen to know that she is still being investigated. Just like the dubious shift chart and the so-called chances of all these mishaps being a coincidence that led to Lucy Letby being convicted of multiple murders, is it not similarly more plausible that this is a stitch-up of Lucy Letby rather than an unfortunate cock-up that has led to this miscarriage of justice? It would be interesting to calculate the odds of it being either one or the other rather than an unfortunate mishap. So I don't think I'm qualified to do that. In fact, I'm sure that I'm not qualified. I have discussed this several times on the channel. I believe that it's an unfortunate cock-up. I don't believe that she was deliberately targeted from day one. I know many people disagree with that, and I've always been open about saying that I can easily be wrong and they can easily be right. And of course, I entirely understand why they feel that way. I just said that to someone today in the comments. I think for me, partly, I don't want to contemplate the possibility that this was a stitch-up. If this was a pure stitch-up and they just decided, right, we're going to stitch Lucy up. We know this; she's not doing anything wrong, but we're going to stitch her up. I mean, that's too much. This is bad enough as it is. I mean, I'd like to think that didn't happen. And I don't think it's the most likely scenario, but I accept that it's possible. In your estimation, the person who's asked this question, is it more plausible? I think it's slightly less plausible, but the thing that is undeniable and of course worrying is that it is indeed plausible. I can't deny that it's plausible. I don't wish to deny that it's plausible. I don't believe that it is a stitch-up, and I don't think we'll ever know. But I can't rule it out, that's for sure. I remain disgusted that other nurses who might have supported Lucy Letby both from a character perspective and in relation to showing what was normal, even expected nursing practice, were cautioned against giving evidence. This needs looking into, as I believe that a hospital that instructs staff to not give evidence with the threat, express or implied, that it will harm their careers is committing the crime of perverting the course of justice and witness intimidation, contrary to S51 Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. So we're going to investigate this now to see whether or not this assertion is correct. So my instinct regarding this would be that it wouldn't apply under all circumstances. What you'd usually find is that the hospital will know what it can do legally and what it can't do legally. I mean, they're lawyered up to the eyeballs, so the chances of them getting it completely wrong are quite slim. There are some comments here about this, so I thought the best thing to do was to ask this AI platform and see what it comes up with. My view is that the hospital will know exactly what they can say, exactly how far they can push it. They'll get legal advice and they'll make sure that they're within those boundaries. So here the answer is yes, your comment is potentially accurate, but it's not automatically a crime in every case. But I would suggest that the answer is no. The hospital knows exactly what it's doing legally, and it will have enforced this, or it will have engaged in this or implemented this in such a way as to ensure that they're not in contravention of the law. However, let's read what is said here. If a hospital actively threatens or pressures staff so they do not give evidence, and that conduct is done with the intention of preventing or influencing evidence, it can amount to the criminal offence of witness intimidation under S51, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994. The problem being here is that no one could give evidence. Giving a witness statement is not evidence. So if they'd said, let's say someone at the hospital, a nurse, had seen someone acting malignantly and it wasn't Lucy Letby, and they wanted to say that in court, and the hospital said, keep out of it, we don't want you to say anything. That would be them actively preventing or influencing evidence being given to the court. A nurse going to court and saying, I believe in Lucy, I think Lucy's a good person, I think she's a good nurse, I don't think she's committed these crimes, is not evidence. It's a witness statement. Is it character evidence? I'm not really sure, but I would suggest that it's not evidence. I'd have to research that further still, but I'm not sure that would come under the auspice of preventing or influencing evidence. And then there's some more discussion here. What would make your view strong evidence that could support a criminal report? Written instructions saying do not give evidence, or threatening adverse consequences for doing so. Witness testimony that managers made explicit threats about careers, references, or disciplinary action if staff cooperated. So probably euphemistic statements were made. It was always according to this Daily Telegraph article, it was along the lines of, oh, it won't be good for your career, not you won't have a career. And that's what I mean about them knowing how far they can push it. A pattern of active steps to suppress statements or produce misleading witness lists, or to remove staff who might give evidence. If those facts exist, police and prosecutors would consider whether the elements of S51 or perverting the course of justice are made out. So another problem you have here is that the police are not favourable to your cause. The police are prosecuting, and the police don't want nurses to appear in court and go against them. So that's yet another problem. Your instinct is legally well-founded. Deliberately discouraging or threatening staff so they do not give evidence can be a crime. Witness intimidation / perverting the cause of justice. Whether it is a crime in any particular case depends on the detail and the intention, and it's a matter for investigators and prosecutors. So what I would say to you is it's very likely that they knew what they could say and that they've done that, and they probably are not in contravention of this. That's just my opinion. So the next thing is another thing where, on this one I just didn't have a clue. Regarding a policy about protecting staff from vexatious allegations, some disciplinary policies mention that sanctions will apply to vexatious allegations. So I've just simply done a bit of research with this because I just didn't have a clue about this at all. And it's quite complicated. So Healthcare employers and regulators routinely recognise vexatious or malicious allegations as a real problem and provide routes to deal with them, but how that is handled depends on who made the allegation, an employee versus a patient third party, and which body is responsible. Employers commonly allow disciplinary sanctions where an employee has made vexatious allegations. Complaints teams commonly treat persistent vexatious complainants as unreasonably persistent and restrict contact or close complaints. Regulators publish guidance on identifying and dismissing vexatious complaints while emphasising fairness and safeguarding. So as you can see, there's lots of regulations here. There's various things about the trust. There's lots of practical elements you should include in a healthcare disciplinary complaints policy. There's more example about things you could write, things to watch for legal risk, don't stifle legitimate complaints, follow fair procedure before disciplining staff, safeguarding obligations override vexatious labels, and so on and so forth. So I think in answer to your original question, I think you raise a very interesting and quite possibly valid point. I think that once Lucy had a grievance procedure upheld, she wasn't going to take any further action. So the hospital, the executives will have wanted an end to this because, as I mentioned, in February, I believe it was 2017, the paediatric staff basically threatened to leave the hospital. Lucy obviously could leave the hospital as well. The nursing staff can't feel great about things. The relationship between the paediatricians, the consultants and the nurses can't be great. So the executives are under enormous pressure because they've got to do all the right things legally, and then they have to knit everything together in terms of personal relationships and get everyone to work together, and so without the hospital falling apart. This is enormous pressure they're under. I mean, I do think that the executives were put in an incredibly difficult position. So they will want to end this, not look at this notion of vexatious allegations. So unless Lucy knew this and unless Lucy pursued this herself, I just don't see it as something that would have been, that anyone would have been open to. But you're probably right in that she would have had a valid case. It certainly seems that she'd have had a valid case based on what I've read. Frankly, she should have gone for constructive dismissal. We now know that she would have likely won it because the lawyer Ian Pay says so. I'm wondering if Dr. Brearey and Dr. Jayaram need to be investigated by the police and why this has not happened yet. So there's definitely an argument for this. Of course, Sir David Davis has written to Cheshire Police and he's made it clear that he should be investigated for perjury. Cheshire Police will not do this because they'd be torpedoing their own case, and they've made it clear that they're acting in self-interest at this point. So there's no prospect of Brearey and Jayaram being investigated in the foreseeable future because Cheshire Police just simply will not do it. Are there any updates on the Dr. Jayaram perjury inquiry? No, none whatsoever, and I don't expect you'll ever hear anything. Just one question. Is there a particular source for Liz Hull promoting a guilt narrative before the trial? There isn't a singular source, but if you look at her content, if you look at what she wrote online, if you look at the podcast, it was always very strongly weighted towards guilt. They seemed almost excited about the prospect that they were dealing with someone who'd potentially killed babies. It seemed like a big scoop that they were excited about. And they often if you listen to podcasts, they often express sentiments of excitement about it being, the thrilling case, the case that's got us all on the edge of our seats. And here's the next anticipated bit, which I think is a little bit distasteful, but I understand as well that they're right. It's a big story, and I don't want to be too critical of them for that. But I will be critical of Liz, and I will be critical of Caroline for, in my view, being extremely biased towards guilt, even now when to be so is ridiculous and embarrassing. Also, I understand that Lucy was wearing pyjamas underneath her sweatshirt and pants when arrested, but I could be wrong. So this is my understanding as well. I believe that Lucy was wearing pyjamas underneath her sweatshirt, and this is why she said it. Why did Myers not remind the jury that Evans was not a neonatologist and his experience was several years out of date? So I can see why you would think this, but actually Myers did tell the judge that Evans was not a neonatologist because, incredibly, Judge James Goss, in his summing up, right at the start of the summing up, he indicates that he believes that Evans is a neonatologist. So that just shows you what a good grasp he had of the case and of the information in the case. I think Myers... You must remember, we haven't seen all of the transcript, even though I've been through the whole complete trial and all the court reporting and so forth. We haven't seen everything that was said, so he possibly did, and he certainly highlighted problems with Evans. Whether he did that strongly enough or not, I don't know, but he also has to be careful about being too aggressive because he's defending a murder, and it's a very delicate balance. I think he did pretty well with cross-examining Evans and pretty well with highlighting that Evans was incompetent, useless, not a suitable person to be in court, not a reliable witness, etc., etc. Unfortunately, due to the way the trial was run and due to the fact that he wasn't, as far as I'm aware, I think I've discussed this again with a future guest who will be coming on next week. I believe I'm right in saying that the judge just said it's not evidence. You interviewing another person is not evidence. The evidence is just the medical opinion that's been put in the court case. So it was all for nothing, really, that he'd cross-examined Evans with some skill at times. I'm not sure that actually would have had the effect on the jury that was wanted, but I think he did okay without outing Evans, but yeah, possibly he could have done other things. Whether it made a difference, I don't know. Why did Goss ignore the warnings about Evans, and how can he claim that those concerns haven't been vindicated? So, as I've said previously, my opinion is that he was just too scared and didn't have the guts to do it because it would have meant the case collapsed. I don't think he could possibly claim that the concerns haven't been vindicated. Obviously, he's keeping quiet. I'm sure he's just enjoying his... I don't know if he's retired. No, he's in a case, wasn't he, recently? These people never retire. But anyway, he's entitled to work if he wants to. That's all I can say about that. Why, in summing up, did Goss not remind the jury they must first be satisfied the crime has actually taken place before they even begin to consider who might have carried it out? So we're going to look at Goss's summing up. I've already looked at one chapter. I'm going to be looking at another chapter, which is the very final chapter, relatively soon. And then eventually we'll start to work through the other chapters. Given that it's an enormous document in common with everything in this case, but we'll get a full impression of that from what Goss said during his summing up, and then we can see whether or not this is a correct or fair statement. I certainly, a friend of mine has looked at this summing up already in some depth, and I know that she's very critical of certain comments that are made. So it'll be interesting to see what he says as the summing up unfolds, but we will get into that along with the closing statement. Those are two big projects that could take months or even years. Why did Goss allow the jury to hear testimony about techniques of death, i.e. injections, inflicting injuries and contamination of food bags, when there was no evidence, be that witness, forensic or even circumstantial evidence, to indicate that they might have actually taken place? So I would firstly say in response to this that I have no idea why he did a lot of things that he did in the case. It's beyond my comprehension. I don't understand the legal system. I don't know why things happen that happen. I don't understand why we put it on such a pedestal when it's just people walking into a room and saying stuff. There's all kinds of crap in this case that really, as I say, you wouldn't put it in a GCSE project, let alone should it be in something of this importance. I really have no idea. In answer to your question, once they are accepted evidence by the Crown Prosecution Service and they're in court, as far as I understand it, the judge can't say, well, this is a load of rubbish, so you're not allowed to say it. Once there is agreed evidence and it's there in the court case, I think it's very difficult to get that kind of thing thrown out, and it's not the judge's place to do that. The judge can exclude certain things if he thinks they're prejudicial, but once that is the case, once that is the prosecution case, and once that's been accepted by the Crown Prosecution Service, I'm not sure it really is the judge's place. But this would be a good question for a legal expert at some point in the future. I've watched all the Letby documentaries. There is barely any mention of the judge. Why is that? I think because there are more kind of compelling narratives to look at. And although the judge may have done things that we disagree with, it's not as serious as the fact that the police investigation wasn't very good, that the medical data that appeared in court wasn't very good, that this panel has come forward, this enormously credentialed panel has come forward dismissing the evidence that appeared in court. So the judge is quite a long way down the list of priorities, which is why, given that Lucy Letby documentaries have I'm assuming you're referring to ones that have been on television, there's only a limited running time and you've got to make decisions and make priorities. Like, as an example, I attended an event that there was filming at for one of the documentaries, and it did not appear in the final film. I know people have done interviews. I know more than one person that's done interviews for documentaries that have been on TV, and they were completely excluded. So you've got to make tough decisions, and the judge, it's just not a big enough story to make the final cut. I seem to recall that Mark MacDonald indicated in February that the CCRC had a team ready to read his report. Nearly 8 months has lapsed, which indicates it's taken someone, maybe more than one, longer to read a report than it took Mark MacDonald to write it. Any thoughts? Well, I guess it's not entirely fair to say they've just read the report, because they need to respond to it and they need to do research because they're not medically qualified. I understand your frustration and I understand the comments, and I'm not in any way saying that you're not making a fair point, but I guess they have to be certain they've made the right decision. You have to bear in mind that as it stands today, Lucy Letby is a convicted murderer of infants, and if you're going to refer that case back to the Court of Appeal and potentially have that person released from prison, it needs to be done assiduously and carefully. And of course we want it to happen quickly, and of course I think the panel reports should make it absolutely clear that there is exonerating evidence and that this should be referred to the Court of Appeal. However, I do have a little bit of sympathy with taking it steadily, because if you allow someone to come out, imagine you allow someone to come out of prison, as an example, and then they later on it turns out they're guilty. There's very clear evidence they're guilty, and it turns out that allowing them to be exonerated was a mistake. Then that's going to look extremely embarrassing for numerous reasons. Or imagine even worse. This is an unlikely scenario, but let's say they're back in prison, and then after they're back in prison, it's found that they murdered someone on the outside. That would be a pretty horrible situation. So they do have to be careful about things like that. So we should cut them a little bit of slack, even though they rightly should be subjected to scrutiny and even criticism. Does anyone know if an IQ test is undertaken by Cheshire police officers when they are being considered for promotion, and if so, is there a minimum IQ requirement? So I wouldn't think that would happen when they're being considered for promotion. As to whether there's a minimum IQ requirement for being in the police, I would assume that there is. Whether this is tested or not, I don't know, but I'll just do some research on this now, and then we can answer this question definitively. Okay, so the answer to this question is that the police don't have a minimum IQ requirement as such, but they do ask applicants to complete cognitive and aptitude tests. So there's a certain degree of intellectual capability that is required to become a police officer. When they're being considered for promotion, it won't be part of the process, because they're approved simply by being part of the police. They'll be looking more at experience, track record, how they interview, personal qualities, etc. Christopher, have you been able to communicate with Lucy? Is she aware of the wonderful support you are giving her? I have sent her a card and will continue to do so from Sydney, where I live. Thank you for what you do. So thank you for sending a card to Lucy, and thank you for watching from Australia. I'm really appreciative of the number of people following me from Australia. I hope things are good for you in Sydney. In answer to your question, I haven't contacted Lucy. I'll come back to that in a second, but in whether she's aware of the wonderful support, as you describe it, that I'm giving her, I don't know. There's a possibility that she is, but I think it's unlikely. But she may become... she's going to become aware of it eventually. That's inevitable. But I wouldn't think that she is at the moment. In terms of whether I've been able to communicate with her, the answer to that question is I haven't tried to communicate with her, because I feel that given my role and given the fact that I've written a book and that may become fairly prominent and I may become fairly prominent as a consequence, I don't want to have any contact with Lucy. I want to remain as dispassionate as possible at all times. There's even been situations where cards have been passed around and stuff in groups that I'm in, and I've never signed them and I've never sent a message or anything like that. And I won't until the time is right. And the time's not right now. When the time is right, then I might consider it. If I feel the time is right. But prior to the publication of the book, I will not be having any communication or contact with Lucy or even sending her a message. And I feel that's the right thing to do. And I won't say any more about it other than that, but hopefully that answers your question. Once again, where the hell was the defence? How on earth did they fail to get Evans removed? He's quite clearly not an expert. They should have known he was not properly licensed. So a good point. I don't feel that this was raised enough in court, but ultimately they made a very credible application to have him removed from the court case, and that was rejected. So I don't think they had the ability to remove him. If the judge says no dice, then there's nothing you can do. What can you do? They could have raised the licensing issue, and the judge could have said, well, yeah, you can say that in court, but it's still up to the jury to decide whether or not he's an appropriate person. So I wouldn't be too hard on the defence on this. I think they did the right thing and they tried to have Evans removed. And if at the end of the day, if the judge won't do it, I mean, I personally find it distasteful. I don't know how anyone else feels about it. But you see court proceedings and you see these transcripts from court, and the extent to which barristers seem to be required to blow smoke up the arse of the judge is I find staggering. I don't think I could be a barrister just for that reason alone, because I'm scrupulously polite and courteous, but I'm just not happy about sitting. It's not my attitude to be saying, yes, Your Honour, no, Your Honour, 3 bags full, Your Honour, or whatever it is they say. They really have to be so obsequious towards the judge, or so it would appear. And I know partly that is because they don't want to annoy him, because they don't want him to rule against whether they're the defence or prosecution. But I mean, Myers did his best to be very, very respectful to Goss, and that did absolutely no good whatsoever. So I find it all very strange, but I think they did their best to get Evans thrown out, and he just wouldn't do it. With reference to the sheer volume of Evans' reports, was he paid per report? Just how much money is Evans trousered? Is there an incentive to keep writing reports? So in terms of being paid per report, I think this is extremely unlikely. Of course, I don't know how he was paid, but he's much more likely to be paid for his time than per report. In terms of how much money he's trousered, it will definitely be a 6-figure sum. Possibly, given he worked for 5 years, we can expect it to be 400,000 perhaps, to maybe 500,000, but he'll have a day rate, and he'll charge them a day rate, and they'll just pay it because they haven't got anyone else. And they became invested in it, and it's a big thing for them, and they got funding from it. So whatever he charged, they will have paid it without even thinking about it. And it will be, for most working people, it will be an enormous amount of money. Is there an incentive to keep writing reports? Arguably, yes. Hi Chris, if Dewi Evans wasn't practicing medicine, who signed him off in 2019, and what evidence bearing in mind he hadn't worked as a paediatrician for 10 years? Good question. So we've got the dates because we've got his registration document. That is just something that as far as I understand, the General Medical Council will assess, and they will just say, I mean, I don't know whose ultimate decision it is. It's, there will be a case officer presumably that looks at it. I don't know. And they must have just assessed that he met the criteria of being a doctor. I mean, if you don't, it's important to understand. I understand where you're coming from, but the fact he hadn't worked as a paediatrician doesn't mean that he can't be registered. If you maintain your registration with the GMC, you will remain a registered doctor even after you've retired. He couldn't have worked as a paediatrician, but he could have. It's not unreasonable for him to be registered. The fact that he's deregistered and then has to re-register is obviously farcical, ridiculous, and so forth. But he probably met the baseline criteria to be registered, is simply the answer to the question. Not only the volume of charges brought, but also the jury had to listen to all the prosecution evidence before hearing any defence. Impossible for them to not lean towards guilty when faced with that barrage. I think this is an unfair ruling, and I think a barrage is a very reasonable description of what it was. And also, I think we can say confidently, if these were individual cases, they wouldn't have gone to court. And she certainly wouldn't have been found guilty. It was hearing them all together, and we talked about this with Stephen Phelps. It's the no smoke but fire theory. And they used that very strategically, the prosecution, and very successfully. But, in a way, there's no point in dwelling on that too much. It's done now. It was allowed to happen. Now we've got to deal with the fallout, and we've got to try and get Lucy out. And there's no point having too many recriminations about the court case because that's all in the past. Is there no mechanism for this is a final question, by the way, is there no mechanism for the opposing side to object to elements of the summing up, or is it just a fabricator's free-for-all? Did Johnson come out with the same dodgy statements during the trial, and if so, did Myers object? So I think it's very difficult to object during the summing up because that is just the judge summing up the arguments of the prosecution and defence. It seems, based on the account that I've seen, that what is normal practice is the prosecution and the defence meet with the judge and try and put their case across and try to make that as credible as possible and try to gain favour from the judge. But I think it would not be looked upon kindly if the prosecution or the defence started saying objection to the judge. I don't think you do that. In terms of whether Johnson came out with the same dodgy statements, absolutely. That's what it's based on. So absolutely he did. And whether Myers objected, there is very minimal evidence of objection during the trial from what I have seen, which is a lot of the court transcripts, a lot of records, and then all the court reporting from every day for the entire trial. And I see very little in the way of objection. And that seems to be simply, that is a practice of UK law, of the UK criminal justice system. So that's all there is to it. They don't object. It's not like a TV movie, like the end of Goodfellas. I don't know if you remember the end of that film where the character Henry Hill is in the witness box and the defence is describing him as a rat and various other things. They're going objection all the way through it, as we often see in American films. Seemingly that doesn't happen in Britain. It certainly didn't happen in this case. So that's the end of this question and answer session. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. Please continue to send me your questions, and there'll be a 7th question or answer session in the foreseeable future when I've got enough questions. If you have any comments, if you'd like to like the video as always, if you'd like to subscribe, this is all very much appreciated. I'll sign off quickly. I'll look forward to reading your comments, and thank you for sending in all these questions. Sorry, finally, if I could just ask people to subscribe to my new channel, which is Lucy Letby Analysis Clips. On this new channel, I'm going to be posting shorter videos, all under 20 minutes, because this is something that people have requested me to do in the past. It's not going to affect this channel, Lucy Letby Analysis, in any way, and in a future video I'll explain why I don't want to do that on this channel. But if you could also possibly watch the video there, my first one that I posted on the channel was Lucy Letby guilty because of her pyjamas, and subscribe to the Lucy Letby Analysis Clips channel, it would be really helpful and appreciated. Thank you.